From Anglo-Saxons to Anglo-Normans, this will be told in a tale-like manner. We have to move from Anglo-Saxons to Anglo-Normans, and only a few remaining points from Anglo-Saxons will be discussed today, and then we will move to what happens under the Anglo-Normans and who are these people who invade. In Anglo-Saxons, a lot has been discussed who were these people, what kind of tribes were they, what were their particular characteristics. And after that, what remains to be said about this is there is an important writer, poet from this time. His name is Cynewulf. And there are a few kings, few important Anglo-Saxon kings. The names of these kings need to be remembered. The one is Alfred the Great. I think I had mentioned this name earlier. And why is he very famous? Why do we need to remember this name? This is around the period that we are now doing. This is between 5th century to around, say, 9th century. From 5th century to 9th century, Anglo-Saxons show a different tradition now. From 5th to 6th century, you see that these pagans have some Roman bishops, Benedictines are being sent from Rome to convert these pagans into Christians. So originally, we know that Anglo-Saxons are the people who believe in paganism, who believe in more than one god. These are Germanic tribes who don't have any idea of Christianity yet. But during this time, re-Christianization of the island of Britain happens. It starts. This begins with exactly around 6th century under a pope. The name of this pope is important. He is Pope Gregory the Great. He is the one who starts sending these Benedictines, Pope Gregory the Great, for re-Christianization of the people on the island. Why do we use the word re-Christianization? Because this process had stopped for a while after the invasion of the Anglo-Saxons and after Rome itself became weak. So re-Christianization starts during 6th century BC, sorry, AD. If you have anything to say, you can raise your hands or unmute yourself. Okay. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I'll repeat what I said about the Anglo-Saxons. So what we're doing about Anglo-Saxons, we did particularly the characteristics of Anglo-Saxons, what they are particularly famous for, what kind of people they were and where they came from. After that, I said what remains to be done in Anglo-Saxons is that this poet is very famous. Cynewulf is important poet from the Anglo-Saxons that needs to be remembered. Remember that we know the name of the writer this time. Other than this, we do have works like Beowulf. The authorship of such poetries is not known, like Beowulf. The second thing I said here was that there are certain kings. There are certain kings who need to be remembered for the great works they did. One such great leader is Alfred the Great. Why is he famous? We'll do this in detail. So today we are doing 5th to 9th century, 5th to 9th century Anglo-Saxon England. Around 6th century, Pope Gregory the Great starts rechristening English people, and also the kings of this kings of Anglo-Saxons, because they are basically pagans. They start this process of rechristening. So why do we use the word rechristening for it? Because this process had stopped for a while when Rome itself became weak, and this process also stopped because Anglo-Saxons invaded Christian type, a new religion, which is paganism. So therefore, it's called rechristening began. What did Pope Gregory the Great do for the people of the island? He sent an entrusted group on a mission. He sent an entrusted group on a mission. This group was a group of Benedictines who worked on the mission of rechristening the pagans. This process started itself in 596 AD when Pope Gregory started the mission. Pope Gregory the Great. And after that, this mission the group of Benedictines was led by a man famously called Saint Augustine. So you don't get to listen to this name much often than you get to hear Saint Augustine. Why do you hear Saint Augustine too much in literature? Because he is directly related to England, whereas Gregory was working from somewhere far away. He was in Rome, and the person who actually uh, traveled to England along with the group of missionaries was the Saint Augustine. Saint. He's a saint, Augustine, who began the mission of conversion in the island again in 6th century. 596 means 6th century. After this, what's important to be noted about Anglo-Saxons is that religious sermons were still given in Latin. Discuss this later. Religious sermons were still given in Latin, and not much of it was yet translated. Though scripts began to be kept in this age, there were scripts, there were writings. Uh, Most of the details that we get about this part of history comes from a historian whose name is Bede. Bede is a famous historian of this time who has recorded the history of the island from this period. The recorded history of Bede dates back to 449. He records the tradition of rulers and the invasion of the Germanic tribes, and how the British, who were the original Celts, they resisted the invasion of these pagans. And he doesn't though associate this with a religious invasion or a religious resistance. He only associates it with nations. Germanic invasions were resisted by the British, and the leader of this British group is this is supposed to be an imaginary figure and not actually a king. That there was this King Arthur who led the team, who led the warriors. He was originally a British. He resisted the invasion of the Germanic tribes, the Anglo-Saxons. So you will see something called Arthurian tradition later on in all the stories that we'll be dealing with, and also in the Chaucer's tales. You find many Arthurian stories based on Arthurian tradition. So, what does this Arthurian tradition mean? It means a tradition where King Arthur, who is associated with good, is fighting against the evil. So, these invaders are associated with evil, the invaders, Germanic tribes. And later on, when Christianity starts to enter the island of England again, King Arthur is, people start associating King Arthur with the Christian kind of good, and oppositional team, who are the Germanic tribes, as the evil, who are also the pagans. So this religious context to it is given later on. Remember, this is still 1449. This religious touch to it is given later on. Bede himself does not give it a religious connotation. Okay, is this part clear? Does this part need any clarification? Okay. Another important names that you need to remember from this part is King Alfred the Great. So, though there are many rulers from this time, Why do we particularly remember some names like the Gregory the Great, Saint Augustine, and King Alfred? There are many kings. Remember this. King Arthur is one, who is supposed to be an imaginary name given to the king who fought against the Germanic tribes, because it wasn't just one king who fought against the Germanic tribes. They invaded from various sides, so it couldn't be just one king who would fight them. So it's this is an imaginary king, King Arthur, who fights against the pagan Anglo-Saxons who are fighting against the Germanic tribes. So King Alfred is the one who starts consolidating the rule. Now, this King Alfred the Great is a real figure. He is not imaginary, he is real. What does he do? Why is he important? King Alfred the Great becomes important because he fights against, during the time of King Alfred, which is ninth century. During this time, it's not just the Anglo Saxons who are fighting, but there is another invasion of the Danish people too. There are Danish tribes who have started attacking. Danish tribes have started attacking too. Remember, you saw in one of the maps later on, a portion of it was called Danelaw. It's that portion which comes under the Danish rulers later on. Okay, so now what does King Alfred do? King Alfred is himself only ruling a small part of the Anglo-Saxon area called Wessex, but he happens to fight these invaders, Danish invaders, and he is the one who happens to consolidate the land of the island, consolidate by fighting Danes in various lands that do not even belong to him, because Danes happen to fight against many rulers in Mercia, in East Anglia, and they have started winning in these parts. So King Alfred is the one who starts consolidating the rule. He starts consolidating Britain as an island. And that's why King Alfred becomes important. Though it's still not, King Alfred is not the one who rules the whole of England. He's not the first ruler to rule the whole of England. It's some other king. I'll tell you the name of the king too. Now, King Alfred is also particularly important, not just politically, but from the context of literature and language too, since Alfred becomes important. Alfred is the one who started the tradition of translating uh, parts of Bible into Anglo-Saxon language, the language now the common people were familiar with, which is Anglo-Saxons. Means there are Celtic traces in the language. Celtic traces means the original language spoken by the people of Britain. There are Celtic traces in the language. There are traces of Angles, and there are also traces of the Saxons. Now, these are the remaining major tribes consolidated by Alfred. That's why we say Anglo-Saxon. Though we remember from the history, there were other invaders also during this time. The invaders were not just Angles and Jutes. The invaders were also, sorry, Angles and Saxons. They were Jutes also, and Vikings. Vikings were attacking. Uh, so Alfred consolidates the rule. Second thing I said is important about Alfred is that he starts popularizing this translation in Vulgate version. Vulgate means the language that common people know. Sermons were now being translated into the Vulgate version, the language that common people know. Part of Bible is translated under King Alfred, only part of it, not the whole of Bible. And also what he himself does is that Alfred himself is a writer. So he reads books in Latin and Greek. Now he is not a commoner, so therefore he has access to that knowledge, Latin and Greek. He reads Latin and Greek. And he is also one of the leaders who has converted to Christianity because of the influence of the missionaries. Though he is not the first king to convert to Christianity, it begins soon after. 596 is the date when they start coming to England. It's 602 AD itself when the first king converts to Christianity. This first king is named Ethelbert. Ethelbert Ethelbert is the king who rules the area called Kent. Ethelbert is the ruler of Kent. Now, why Kent if we don't know this name? As part of the four major kingdoms that are left during this period, four major kingdoms, because the kingdoms we talk about in this time, and the map I show, and I show you the four major kingdoms of Anglo-Saxons is this time. This time is 9th century, and this is still 602 when Ethelbert is ruling a part called Kent. I hope I'm clear with you. And he is the first king who converts, and later on, there are many other who are baptized, like the one ruler from West Saxon king. West Saxon is ruled by Sein Gisl. He rules West Saxon. He too converts. And now there is a great time gap between 1602 to the time when King Alfred starts ruling, which is 871. So he too is a Christian king. I hope this is clear with you how Anglo Saxons become Christians. And now from here on, they do have a tradition of writing which comes from their roots, the Germanic roots of writing, imaginative writing, that comes from their roots of being Germans, basically coming from the Germanic tribes. And this Alfred the Great too is himself a writer. What does he do? He himself translates a few philosophers of the time, not of the time, philosophers from the previous time. The basic texts that the important texts that he translates are from Rome. These are Roman texts. Um, the first one is titled The Consolation of Philosophy. The Consolation of Philosophy. This was originally written by Boethius. This name is also important because this will figure in many other texts, the background of the text of the writers we do. Like Chaucer, was Chaucer familiar with Boethius? Did his reading of Consolation of Philosophy affect any of his stories? This will figure in the later part of the story, or later part of the lectures in history and also in other papers. The second text that Alfred himself had translated was the one by Saint Augustine. The text was called the Consolation Soliloquies. The Consolation, no, sorry, it was just called Soliloquies. This was by Saint Augustine. Saint Augustine also writes his own autobiography in that time. This is read in classical literature. In masters, they have a paper, classical literature, but they don't have Saint Augustine's autobiography because that figures in non-fictional prose, whereas the literature you have in classical literature is only the fictional writings of the time. Saint Augustine, this is you. Saint Augustine had written soliloquies, which King Alfred translated. He also translated Boethius's The Consolation of Philosophy, and these were also the texts, Roman texts, from which he was himself influenced. His influenced his influence was to such a great extent that he himself sat down and translated them into Anglo-Saxon language. Anglo-Saxon language can be detected this, from the use of letters like this for the sound v. Okay, and A for the sound, AE, modern AE, and many other such words and letters that you must have figured out by now. So that's all from also, yeah, one important thing that Alfred did is that he started a chronicle called Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. In this Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, they used to print uh, the works done by many writers of their time. The writers would write, and Anglo-Saxon Chronicle would be the one that would publish their works. Now, important poets that you need to remember from Anglo-Saxon tradition is Cynewulf. What is important about Cynewulf is his four important poems. The titles need to be remembered. I'll write down the titles on board and you will note these down. These are the texts important written by Cynewulf. The first one is called Juliana. These are all poetries. Juliana. The second one is Christ too. The third, Fates of Apostles. And the last, Eileen. Overtly, the titles tell you that he is a writer who is writing in the tradition of, mm, what do we call it? They do appear to be religious poems, and apparently they are mystical, that have a mystical element in it. They also like the figuration of Christ. So, what do you find together in Steinwolf and the works he does? We find that he is, though basically from a Celtic origin, because of the name that you see, Sign and Wolf. Wolf you saw in Beowulf, the tradition of wolf. Why do they have wolf in their name? Then the spelling sign, the spelling CY is used in this time, which you don't see being used in modern English. So he's basically Celtic, so he has an influence of Anglo-Saxon language because he writes in Anglo-Saxon English. All his poetry is in Anglo-Saxon English. And the third is that the religious element you find, which is Christian element in all his famous poems that have existed so far. The manuscripts of these poems are available with us today. So that's all about Anglo-Saxons. Any questions about Anglo-Saxons? I'll take the questions first and then we'll move on to Anglo-Normans.